Hey there! This is my final Game of the Day video for Altibox Norway Chess 2018, and we did get a tremendously exciting Game of the Day, arguably Game of the Tournament, for our final round of the tournament, and I'm sure there still will be people who feel somewhat disappointed that the huge tiebreak, which was on the cards at some point, did not materialize. But in terms of the excitement provided by one game, I think it's very difficult to wish for more. And the game I'm talking about is, of course, the game that Fabiano Caruana played against Wesley in the final round. So let's start talking about that. But briefly, tournament situation has to be mentioned, and I will be returning to it as the video goes on, because it becomes more and more relevant, I think. The players obviously were, to a certain degree, looking over their shoulder as the game progressed. Sorry, I can't really speak English anymore. Before the round started, Magnus Carlsen and all three Americans were on +1. The two Americans in this game, as you can see, playing each other, Fabi with the white pieces. Hikaru Nakamura was black against Levon Aronian, which is not a game you expect very many people to win, unless obviously Lev is in horrible shape and overpresses, or both. And Magnus himself had black against MVL, who did have an absolute nightmare of a tournament, but with the white pieces, with his extremely solid repertoire, and the additional dynamic of having been Magnus's second for the match against Karyakin, that game also a lot depended on Magnus's opening choice. And once we had seen e4, e5, I already felt that some kind of a quiet game is very much on the cards, although I didn't really expect the game to be as quiet as it was. Basically theoretical repetition and the game over in 17 moves and about 20 minutes. And that left the game between Fabi and Wesley, and also the game between Sergei Karyakin with the white pieces against Vishy Anand, in which Vishy, with a victory, could get to +1 and potentially join in the fun of the tiebreak on the next day. Let's start talking about the moves now. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6. No real surprises there, very, very solid opening repertoire shown here by Wesley. And Fabi declines the invitation to play some kind of a classical Berlin. Wesley goes bishop c5, as people do in this position, and Fabi goes for castles, which is not the most popular move in this position currently. But it always existed. It was just sort of a poorer cousin of c3, which is by far the main move in this position, and also there is all this theory connected with takes, and let's say knight bd2, whereas there's obviously there's been a lot of developments here, but that's a whole other subject. Castles is less popular precisely because it allows black to play knight g4, takes, and in this position, as we already started discussing with Jan during the live show, it's very difficult, at least optically, to understand why black should be worse here, because the structure is rather symmetrical. The knight on c6 getting traded for the knight on f3 in general should favor black because it allows him to play c7, c6, in some cases maybe even followed by the quick d7, d5, which is something which you would very much like to do in a lot of Spanish / Giocopiano positions. And generally speaking, it's really unclear why black should be worse here. Fabi starts with a rather weird looking move, bishop a4. It's not, once again, there must be some point to it, but in most cases I think it will just lead to transpositions, because black generally plays c6 and the bishop always goes to a4 in these positions. c6 played by Wesley, deciding not to investigate what happens if he avoids the transposition. c3, knight, bishop b6, knight a3. We're still following, for instance, the game Levon Aronian won with the black pieces against Magnus Carlsen, d6. Magnus played bishop b3 here, which allowed Levon to play a5 and bishop a7, keeping the bishop on this long diagonal. And he won a very brilliant game in the Euro Teams 2015 in Reykjavik. And there is a lot of theory connected with knight c4, bishop c7, bishop c2, and here by this point it's well established that black can play castles, bishop g5, and probably the cleanest way to continue here is to play h6, and after bishop h4 you can play d5, and this position is just fine for black, as far as I could figure out by sort of leafing through recent Grandmaster practice. And my guess is a potential point of playing bishop c2 with the knight still on a3 would be after castles to play bishop g5, bishop h4, and if black plays d6, d5 here, he does not win a tempo by attacking the knight on c4. It still looks rather flimsy to me, and I don't think black really suffers very much here. But Wesley goes for a different approach. He goes bishop e6, queen e2, and h6. And I think these moves are very much an indication that Wesley felt that his way of winning the tournament, and I mean it will sound kind of trite and self-evident, but it should still be said that Magnus, had there been a large tiebreak on the final day, Magnus would have started as a serious favorite in that tiebreak, because he is very, very good in these situations, hasn't lost a tiebreak in a very, very long time, and in general starts as a favorite in any kind of a tournament with shorter time controls, reigning World Blitz champion, of course. And h6, and in particular bishop e6 followed by h6, I think is an indication that Wesley was very much hoping to at least, give Fabi options which would make this game a lot sharper. Because I really feel that if black wanted to castle kingside and have a normal, very typical for this line position, he could have done this even against this move order. And Fabi obliges by playing king h1, which is a peculiar looking move, which led to a very, very interesting game. We can't complain, but objectively this move deserves probably close to a full question mark. It's just not very good. Instead of that, white could have played knight c4, and there are weird positions possible for black to, after, let's say, takes, and a5. I couldn't quite decide what I thought about this structure, because the white bishops are not very impressive, but black will never have any pawn breaks either, so you can maybe even go for some very, very slow plans like a4, castles, and then you go rook d1, and you say, I will eventually go rook d3, g3, then I will play maybe b3, bishop d2, rook d1, and then maybe even bring the second rook to the same squares via the same the same route. And black is just, if black ever pushes d5, these bishops become monstrously strong. So black is more or less completely restricted to waiting in a position like this. Which is why I think Wesley probably would have gone bishop c7. He has gone bishop c7 in a similar situation in the game. And now white can play f4, which does look like a very typical justification for what white is doing in this line in general. And here, once again, I tried figuring out who is better here, and I think if black castles kingside, you can take, and play knight e3, creating ideas of knight f5, this bishop returns to b3. This is quite nice for white. It's not winning by any means, but it's very, very nice. And if black takes on c4 and does something like this, yes, the positions become very unclear, but generally speaking, I think it's the kind of unclear that white doesn't mind at all. And not only was knight c4 natural and quite strong, king h1 is just not a good move. For the very obvious reason, which I'm sure Wesley considered at the time, and I'd be curious to find out why he didn't make it. There is an option here of playing knight g4. White is more or less obliged to play g3. If you play h3, black can play queen h4. King g1 is the only move to, stay in the game competitively. You can play bishop e3, and it might even objectively be stronger, but you're just not going to enjoy this position because you've spoiled your structure, and also this bishop is just so much better than the knight on a3. And after king g1, during the live show, we thought maybe this is just winning for black, using this idea to seemingly force the queen away and then give mate. But instead, white can play d4, a move we somehow completely overlooked during the live show. And this is a kind of unclear position, which probably ends up being slightly better for white even, so black shouldn't do it. But after king g1, black can play h5. And now queen g3, let's say if white makes some kind of a waiting move, queen g3 will just win on the spot, because this is now mate. And this threat is so strong that white has to make an awkward move, queen f3. And now both d5 and even g5, creating a threat of rook h6, rook f6. All of these things are quite strong for black. In view of all that, white probably needs to play g3, stopping queen h4. And here, black has a very strong option of playing h5. We thought during the live broadcast the knight f6 was strong, but here, once again, after knight c4 and knight e3, the fact that black has bishop h3 doesn't really change the evaluation very much. This is playable for white. But h5 is very strong. h3, h4 is, I mean, doesn't bear thinking about, which is why white has to play h4. And in this position, black can play queen d7, very important move, making it a lot more difficult for white in general to play knight c4, let's say, later on, because there will be some tactics connected with the queen landed on h3. And if white plays f3, the computer, after some thought, goes knight h6, king h2, long castles, and if bishop e3, it takes, king b8, and to my initial surprise, it gives black a very, very large advantage here. And then I realized that because of the pawn structure on the king side, there is really no good way to stop a very simple plan of playing f6 and g5 and blowing up the white king side. And any kind of a play white can attempt on the other side of the board would be much, much slower. And yeah, the machine gives this a very, very big advantage for black, and I don't think it's wrong. Therefore, knight g4 would just give black an immediate, very comfortable position. A better position even. Instead, Wesley played g5, which is also a very understandable move. It stops f4 completely and kind of asks the question, okay, where is your play now, Mr. Player of the white pieces? And Fabi went with a very slow plan. He played knight c4, bishop c7, and in this position, he played knight e3, which really isn't fast enough and would have led him into serious difficulties. What he should have done, I believe, is to play something like f3 with the intention of putting the bishop on e3 and pushing for d3, d4 breaks. And black is not worse necessarily, but the position becomes a lot more balanced than in a game. I'm not sure if that's what Fabi wanted, a balanced position, but his plan of kind of taunting black and giving him all kinds of tempi and all kinds of progress in the center and on the king side objectively should have backfired. He played knight e3, Wesley played d5, he played rook e1. I was slightly confused by this move during the live show, but his future play explains it. Basically, if white plays bishop d2 immediately, which of course is a lot more natural than rook e1, there will never really be, I mean, there will eventually be an open e-file in the game, or semi-open e-file, but not for some time yet. But the point is that here, after d4, the knight really has to go to f5, because knight d1 is just way too ugly to even contemplate. And in this position, black just has a very safe option of bringing the king over to g7. And these two guys are not great. Neither of them really has any real future. And black has a, I'd argue, small but very stable advantage here. So rook e1, queen e7. Once again, Fabi had the option of sort of bailing out with e takes d5. If black takes with a pawn, white can go pawn grabbing. I mean, I wouldn't call it bailing out, but it is an idea that white could have considered, although his position, of course, remains very dangerous, because these are very dangerous bishops. In particular, the idea of playing queen d6 at some point, forcing white into some concessions on the king side, and then ramming the Harry the h-pawn down the board. That all would be very dangerous, and also white's pieces don't make very much sense in view of the appearance of this pawn on e4. But Fabi just, I think Fabi and Wesley, sort of by mutual unspoken agreement, they were aiming for the same type of a position. Fabi goes a4, saying, okay, castle queenside if you dare. Wesley says, there, what do you mean there? Perfectly fine, castling queenside. Fabi goes rook b1, because immediate b4 would be very awkward after d4, and this pawn will start hanging simply. So white even has to waste a tempo on rook b1, d4, and the knight goes back to f1. And this looks kind of horrible for white, frankly. And the move Wesley made here is, well, we were told by our ever watchful chat that the move Wesley chose here is a large mistake, which turns a serious advantage into equality. But they didn't tell us what the correct move was, and as I found out when preparing the video, I actually suggested the correct move during the live show, but I connected it with a completely wrong idea. Black can play g4 here, which is very strong, but I thought the idea would be to play something like h5, h4, and then either h3 or g3, trying to open up some files on the king side. Whereas in actual fact, the idea is very, very simple. You play g4 to stop white from controlling the h5 square, and then quite simply you go knight h5 and you go knight f4. And white is surprisingly hard pressed to meet this very, very simplistic threat. If white goes f3, sort of trying to recognize that his position is dangerous and there are things happening on the king side which you don't like, then black takes, goes knight g4. And once again, compared to similar things that happened in the game, black is just several tempi up. And he will have tremendous initiative on the king side. Maybe even describing it as initiative is a little bit unfair, because white will scramble to defuse this attack. But the main point is after bishop d2, black can play knight h5. And if white plays g3, black plays knight f4 anyway. And gf, ef, the computer assesses this position as basically close to lost for white. And it's not even entirely surprising, frankly, considering like there's this group of pieces which don't really participate in the defense. They're just the cramping white style, and a very simple threat of f3 followed by queen h4 and queen h3, or first queen h4 and then f3, queen h3, will be very, very difficult / impossible for white to meet. After knight h5, the computer finds a cute little tactic to play bishop b3, basing it on the fact that this wins the piece back. But even here, after bishop b3, there is a very comfortable choice for black. He can play queen h4, continuing to insist that the same ideas will be very strong even some moves later. Or he can even simpler play knight f4, bishop e6, take with the queen. And once again, look at this knight on f1 compared to this beautiful bishop on c7, supporting eventual opening up of the king side. H-pawn all the way to h3 continues to be a very strong threat. And also there is nothing really going on the other side of the board. So black is dominant here. After g4, in particular, if white doesn't immediately realize what the plan is, black would have, I believe, very, very strong winning chances. The fact that the machine suggests that the best reaction to g4 is actually give black a semi-open file on the king side is striking. I don't think very many people would consider playing f3 here, because generally, as you will see later in the game, black has to work really, really hard to get white to commit any pawn from the second rank to the third rank, where it can be attacked and exchanged by black pawns. Instead of all that, Wesley played bishop b6, which I praised during the live show, because white more or less declared that he wants to play b2, b4 at some point, and that means that once he does that, black can take on c3 and put a piece on d4, and this square looks like a very attractive square for the black pieces, but it's much slower than what has gone on before. Bishop d2, and here once again Wesley did something which I thought was quite sensible, and to humanize it, it really does make a lot of sense. But once again, it's much slower than on the previous move. But g4 here in particular connected with the idea of meeting b4 with takes, takes, and g3, followed by knight g4, is pretty decent for black here. And as a matter of fact, if white doesn't want to get involved in some horrible craziness with, let's say, f3, black plays, for instance, knight h5, bishop takes e5, rook g8. The machine says this is a draw somehow, but I didn't even want to click through to find out how. I mean, if this is a draw, you know, you can do whatever you please with that information. It doesn't feel like a draw to a human player. It can be better for white, it can be better for black, but draw it definitely isn't, regardless of what the machine evaluation is. There is, however, a draw for white if he takes on g3 with the f pawn, knight g4, h3, h5, and here you need to play a5, but this is the most obvious move in the position, and black just gives a perpetual. Instead of all these things, Wesley played bishop g4, losing 2 full tempi to make white play f3, which once again should give you an idea of how important human players view the idea of forcing white to give him a target to open stuff up on the king side. Fabi plays knight g3, which is something the computer quite likes, and here black had a funny opportunity to try something. It's not very good, but I'll show it because just as during the live show, I feel that the geometrical idea here is quite beautiful. Bishop takes g5, h4, knight f5, black takes, white takes, black takes on c3. And here, if white kind of loses patience for a second there and stops calculating takes on c3, knight h5, bishop e7, knight g3 is a very nice way to get mated by force. And this is why black included d takes c3 in this position, to take control over the g1 square. But unfortunately for black, white just takes on e5 here, and none of these tactics work anymore, and this just wins for white. Wesley played rook hg8. This, once again, the computer disagrees with this decision and says that bishop b6, c7, in order to improve your play on the king side by playing, basically, the idea is to play before h5, and in comparison with the lines we just showed, the pawn on e5 will be protected here, which is a very large deal. And after bishop c7, the computer suggests this is a balanced, somewhat equal position. But once again, you have just played bishop c7, b6 on move 18. You just don't play bishop b6, c7 here. It's not how you operate as a human being. It is very possible to accept your mistakes and make moves which go backwards, but just not in this position. It's not intuitively. I mean, obvious is a really weird word to use here. It's just not in the same universe as obvious that you need to move the bishop back. Wesley played rook g8, and finally we come to kind of actual tactical skirmishes. b4, g4, a5, black takes on c3, a very important intermediate move. Once again, that was Wesley's plan all along, to establish control over the d4 square like this, takes, takes, b5. And all this play is reasonably logical, but in this position, Wesley had an important option, which I'm not sure he spent very much time considering. I also kind of assumed that c6, c5 is an autopilot move you make here in all cases, but in actual fact, c takes b5, rook takes b5, and in this position the move rook b4, which I think is very easy to miss that it even exists. And the point is, if you take on e5, this rook is kind of stuck and it will get probably attacked and picked up by the black pieces. For instance, something like queen d6, f4, knight d7, or queen c7 perhaps is even more precise. Queen c7, f4, knight d7 looks quite attractive. There's also rook b4, b2 ideas here. So in this position, white is rather forced to take on b4. After rook b1, black takes on b5, rook takes b5, and once again goes simply king c8, b8. And the computer is saying that black is better here because he switches actually from playing on the king side to plans concerning rook c8, let's say queen c7, and also very importantly, once a pair of rooks comes off, white is never really going to create anything along the b file because there's just not enough attackers, and a6 is always well met by b6. Best move here is rook takes b4, queen takes b4, and here it's important for white, if he wants to continue playing double H positions, to take on g4. Because if you play a6, black takes on f3, ab, and here you can even take on b7 with the king, but I think most human players would play king b8 in this position, keeping this pawn as cover for your own king. White is forced to take with the pawn because otherwise the rook would hang, and black plays something like rook c8 or queen b2 or queen c3. Many moves are possible here. And this bishop is so much better than this bishop, and endgames will be very good for black because the black has an outside passer. So this is very comfortable for black. Maybe not better if white plays correctly, but very, very comfortable. But Wesley I don't think considered very seriously any kind of an idea like this, trading pieces, opening files in front of your own king. Who plays like that? So he played c5, and at this point I was very strongly pushing the narrative that it is black who made by far the most progress, because white cannot really open any files on the queen side. a6 is always met by b6, and vice versa, obviously. And black is seemingly already doing something on the king side, and I was just dead wrong. In this position, the computer suggests that even something like rook f1 is very strong, but the move I was kind of hailing as the most obvious option here, queen e3, followed, however, not by gf, but by gf, queen takes f3. The machine suggests this is significantly better for white. It is based on a very precise calculation, though. After knight g4, I'm not sure how much better white is if he doesn't have this tactic, h3, queen h4, and here knight f5 is almost winning, because after knight f2, it turns out that white can play king g1, knight h3, and king f1, and black just loses a lot of material, because this is hanging, this is a check, and now this knight will fall. In view of all that, in this position, the computer suggests black needs to start retreating, something like king b8, rook f1, knight e8. And here you can sort of see why white would be better. If black is not really achieving anything on the king side, it is quite clear that white has achieved something on the queen side. This is not a very safe king. The bishop can always go to b3. White also has the option of playing knight f5 in most of these positions. This is a very pleasant endgame for white. Well, not an endgame, but I mean a very pleasant position. Fabi played bishop b3 though, which is once again a very natural move. The bishop on c2 looks really, really stupid, doesn't really have much future, and bringing it to b3 where it can go to c4 supporting your own structure, or in some cases will be traded for the bishop on e6, maybe allowing you to land the knight on f5, feels very, very nice and natural for white. Not as strong as queen e3 though, and the reason for that is black could have taken on f3 here. And if white takes with a pawn, you can play knight d7, for instance, and start stabilizing. And if you take with the queen, compared to the line we just discussed, it's actually, for some reason, somehow to white's detriment that the bishop is on b3 compared to the bishop on c2. I guess because rook takes d3 followed by knight f2 is a threat, so you cannot even play h3 here. Rook d3 is very strong. Wesley played a very natural move in reply, though. h5 looks very, very logical, hoping for some h4, h3 counterplay. Fabi decides to get ahead of that particular type of play and goes knight f5, takes, takes. And white is actually quite a bit better here. And here I started feeling that my evaluation was just completely wrong. It was also pointed out to me by computer, but here you can see why white could be doing quite well. The bishop is actually quite strong on this diagonal. The structure on the king side is reasonably safe for white. And there will be some play against the black king. So this clearly represents an improvement in white's fortunes. The machine suggests you have to take on f3, and in this particular position it takes with the pawn for whatever reason. Probably stopping knight g4 and d5 before counterplay counts for more than pawn structures here. And after knight d7, which it considers to be the best move, white plays b6, a6, rook bc1, and here combining threats of, in some positions, going rook g1 and going after the black structure on the king side, and in some positions going rook c4 to trade off the best piece black obviously has in this position, which is the rook on d4. White has a significant advantage. Wesley played rook e8, for the time being not taking on f3. And Fabi actually committed a slight inaccuracy here. He should have started with b6, a6, and only here played rook bc1. And white is much better, for sort of very similar reasons that we just discussed. Bishop is very good, knight is now somewhat restricted. White has a lot of play against various black weaknesses that will become apparent quite soon. In particular, the king is just not very safe when there's these pawns in front of it, and if it goes to b8 it will be locked in, and you can never really allow white to give even a single check to a king like this, because it will often lead to immediate collapse. Fabi started with rook bc1, and once again, without the help of a computer, I would not have understood what's happening here, but the machine says that going king b8 here and meeting b6, which seemingly leads to similar positions, with g takes f3, and if queen takes, you go knight g4, and once again, tactics with rook takes d3 and queen h4 create decent counterplay for black, and after g takes f3, very importantly, instead of a move a6, which would lead to a transposition, black has knight d5, creating the idea of knight f4, and also in some cases attacking this pawn on b6, kind of forcing white to take. And the black king is a lot safer in this situation, when white was forced to trade off his pawn on b6 for the pawn on a7. Also, black manages to create a decent amount of counterplay here, and the machine suggests this is about roughly equal, because both kings are not very safe, and there's very likely a lot of exchanges coming up soon. Instead of this, Wesley took on f3, queen takes f3, and played rook e d8. Instead of rook e d8, machine suggests playing queen d7, giving up the pawn on c5 with check. Nobody really plays like that, so it's kind of futile to even discuss. But I will say that the machine, after some thinking, says that you can take and then just play h3, return the pawn, play rook e3, stabilizing, stopping knight g4 play. And this is somewhat weak, this is somewhat weak. And the king on b8 is a really, really poor piece. So white retains a decent amount of advantage here, although black is of course not defenseless. Rook e d8 objectively is maybe even you can say this is a losing move. But the way to refute it would have been, sort of grounds for one of those grounds for disqualification type deals, because the largest advantage white can get here would be if he finds a6, which of course Fabi considered, but after rook takes d3, you don't go for endgames with queen takes b7. You take with the pawn, king b8, and you play queen c6, leaving the bishop on b3 unprise. And after both rook takes b3, rook c5, queen b7, queen f6, and for instance, like a final bird flip from white to black, after rook g8, queen e5, king a8, you can play queen e2, seemingly missing a very beautiful tactic and resigning. But no, instead of resigning, white plays rook c8 check, distracts one of black's pieces from attacking the pawn on g2, picks up this rook, and is effectively winning because his king is safer and he's also a pawn up. And after queen c6, black can try knight g4, but even here, let's say rook c5, queen b7, takes, white can take on f7, rook d1, return with the rook to c1, and this is probably a technically winning position for white. Once again, some work probably will be required, but it's work that Fabi, I think, would find not very onerous. But what is almost impossible, in particular in horrible time trouble, is to find the whole idea of giving up your bishop for this attack with queen 6 and rook c5. I also probably, I promised to mention the tournament situation in more detail, but what has to be said is that Magnus's game finished in the first 20 minutes, and that effectively meant that the winner of this game becomes the sole winner of the tournament. The fact that Vichy by this point has beaten Sergei Karyakin did not really change very much for these players. It meant that there will be a four-way tie for first if they draw instead of a five-way tie for first instead of a four-way tie. But still, whoever wins wins Norway Chess 2018. At this point, Wesley had significantly more time than Fabi. Fabi was playing something like 7 minutes, I believe, this point, maybe even slightly less. And Wesley had, I think, more than 10. And it's very understandable that Fabi chose not to even attempt to seriously calculate a6, because bishop c4 also looks very attractive. Securing your structure and, not really giving up any material in horrible time trouble where you're not entirely sure you're calculating cleanly. Objectively, after knight g4 here, black is not doing very, very poorly. He wants to get sort of better versions of what he got in the game. If white plays a6, you can play e4, d4, queen e5, and this is like a 10 times improved version of exactly the idea that Wesley played in the game. Best move according to the machine is f6. Black plays queen d6, and yeah, this is some kind of a mess which I think black might even hold with precise play. Although precise play after g3, for instance here, the computer suggests you have to play king c7. Well, not have to, but this I believe is the best play, with the idea of meeting a6 by takes, and rook b8. And yeah, once again, not something that would be easy to find on very, very limited time available. Instead, Wesley went for a very, very natural for a human player idea. He played e4, d4, and queen e5. You can make an argument for starting with knight g4 instead, but queen g3 is very strong here, with the idea of meeting knight e5, which looks very attractive for a second, with bishop e6 check, fe, and queen takes e5, and white is just completely winning. Which is why queen e5. And Fabi, for a while, plays sort of in a very, very clear computerish style, but very, very strong moves. And not really impossible to understand either. Bishop takes f7, it looks like a kind of crude materialism, but what's important is that not only is white now has an additional extra pawn, which might become a passed pawn in any kind of an endgame, he also has bishop f7, e6 checks, which is, a useful new supported location for the bishop, which was looking somewhat unsafe on c4. So bishop f7, as we already discussed, knight g4, queen g3 is just bad for black. So Wesley goes rook d3, queen f2, rook a d4, protecting the pawn on c5, bishop d5, by far the strongest move in the position. And at first, I think if you look at this position, you think this is not clear at all. There's all kinds of counterplay with knight g4 or rook d2 or a combination thereof. And then you realize that rook takes c5 is a huge big threat, and black is just sort of never enough to even create any serious attack. If you go, for instance, king b8, rook takes c5, after rook d4, rook d2, as usual, white has queen g3, and after knight g4, you play queen h4, and suddenly it is white that is threatening mate in 1, and the position is just completely lost for black. He has a very beautiful geometric idea here of playing rook h3, but unfortunately, white doesn't have to react. Which is why Wesley played king d7, to at least control those d8 squares and all these types of variations. And this is where Fabi committed his one really, really large mistake of the game, because the move he made is just very difficult to understand. That was the one moment in the game where he sort of cracked and chose something weird. He was on very, very low time, but in particular, in a situation where you don't have time to think properly, the move he chose did not feel like it was needed. And I'm curious what he saw that made him reject rook takes c5, creating an obvious threat of bishop e6 or bishop c6 check, picking up the queen. If black goes king d6, you just come back to c1 as usual, and after rook d2, queen h4, black will never really threaten anything at all, because as usual knight g4 is impossible because of queen d8 mate. The same applies to this position, of course. And if black plays knight g4 here, you can play queen h4, and after rook h3, once again, obviously gh, queen h2 is unattractive, queen takes h3, knight f2 is unattractive, but bishop e6 check is perfectly serviceable. King here, we take, they take, we go rook d5 check, and this position is completely and utterly winning for white, because rook takes h2 is one check, and the rook is even completely stuck on h2, it will never really come out. So that would be sort of resignable for black. And as mentioned, it's really difficult to figure out what scared Fabi in this position. Maybe he didn't like rook d2, queen takes d2, rook takes d2, and maybe he only saw bishop e6 check, after which it might actually take a while for white to win this position, although the computer suggests it is of course still winning with 3 extra pawns. But this bishop is a bit passive, and black does have some counterplay, at least in the sort of initial 5 moves here. But instead of all that, you can play bishop c6 check, pick up on e5, and then take on b7, and white will just create an additional passed pawn on the queen side, and once that happens, the game is just utterly over. The position after rook takes c5, I think Wesley would have struggled to continue the game here. It's just impossible to create any threats. And in most cases, white's moves afterwards are just very logical. You trade pieces where you can. If the rook is traced away, you just bring it back. And then you create threats against this king whenever possible, and the game ends. And more importantly, you just control all the threats that black can create. Instead of all that, on a minute, Fabi thought for most of his remaining time and played b5, b6, which is a surprisingly strange decision, considering it doesn't really create any new threats, and what it does basically is give black a full tempo to do something. And there was sort of a half moment where tie breaks became a favorite again, because after ab6, ab6, Wesley correctly played knight g4. Here, obviously, when white doesn't have additional checks, queen h4 would just lose to rook h3. This is not something you want to do, because as I've already pointed out, this is a very typical tactic. Fabi wasn't going to blunder that, obviously, but after queen g1, black now has an immediate forced draw. It's not an easy draw, but I believe the idea that Wesley found in the game is very similar, and I thought he is likely to find it just sort of by stumbling upon it. Black can play, king d8 is what Wesley played, which is not a good move objectively, but it's connected with a very devious idea. But we will come to that. Also, the timing situation, I wish I would remember exactly how much time Wesley had at this moment. Fabi was playing on seconds. Fabi, I can say that he was sort of barely making move 40, but I think Wesley had maybe 2 minutes at this point. And this brings us to another important talking point, so I will mention that. You probably know that, but it is very important to what happened here to say that the time control in the tournament was 2 hours, hang on a second, 140 for 40, 50 for the next 20, and the increment only started from move 61, which is hugely relevant, because it meant that not only was there no additional time added to the players' clocks after each move, but also very relevantly, you are not obliged to keep your score sheet. Once you fall below 5 minutes on your clock, you are allowed just to mark the number of moves you made and not actually write down the moves that you made. It is perfectly within the rules. But it also means that you could potentially lose track of how many moves you made. And it did, to my frankly huge surprise, because these are very experienced players in general. I mean, they are young, but regardless of what their age is, they have been playing on the elite circuit for a very long time. It did become very relevant. But as for the objective assessment of the position, black could play rook d2, and this feels like this is exactly the kind of a move you make when you're very short on time. Creates a very simple threat. makes your opponent play rook f1, and you play h4. Creates a very simple threat, more or less forces white to play h3. And here there's a fork in the road, but already importantly, if you keep your score sheet properly here, you know it's move 41. And here you can get up, go wash your face, get yourself a drink of something, and you realize that queen g3, which looks like the most obvious move in the position, and it actually does win if white makes a horrible mistake and allows h3. Allows white to play bishop takes b7, and after knight f2 check rook f2, it turns out that black really does not have any attack, and after, let's say, queen takes f2, white just goes e4, e5, and all the passed pawns he has, with the fact that the bishop is now back coordinating with the other pieces and protecting the white king side, the machine says this is just completely and utterly winning for white. But after h3, and once again, it's important for you to stop here and consider your options. You can play rook d3, creating the threat of rook takes h3 and rook h2, which is kind of made. White has to take, only move, h3, rook f2, strictly only move, you take, queen takes g2, only move, you take, queen h8 check, king g1, and queen h3. And white does not have any relevant checks on the other side of the board, and he can make a draw in a variety of ways here. White is not worse. For instance, you can play e5, bringing the bishop back to defense, but black can take on d5, and the queen on h3 is just so active that white is never better here. One possible way to finish the game would be e6 check, king e8, queen f4, rook d4, queen b8 check, rook d8, and now queen f4 back, rook d4, and a threefold repetition will be the result here. But instead of all that, Wesley, I guess, burns most of his time and plays king d7, d8. And I think the point of this move was, as I mentioned, Fabi had very, very little time. And if you play rook d2 here, Fabi will just play rook f1. There is no other moves. You will never really even force him to think. And I suspect that Wesley was very much interested in giving Fabi choices, because perhaps he did not believe he was doing very well after rook d1, rook d2, rook f1, and he wanted to at least make Fabi think on, the very, very last seconds. And making a surprise move in this position is generally a good idea. It's just not a very good move. But Fabi falls sort of straight into the trap here. Something like rook f1 is completely winning for white once again, because black is just not fast enough with his counterplay anymore. It's just a full tempo you've given white to do something. For instance, if black plays h4 here, you can play f6. f7 cannot be allowed, so you have to take. And once this queen rejoins the game becomes just completely over. The black position collapses because white, once again, once white gives one check in this position, the game is over. But on the dying seconds of the first time control, Fabi goes h3. And it looks like it's completely winning at first, but then you realize that there's this rook takes h3 move. And I was pretty sure this is what Wesley was planning. But after g8, the final horrible dramatic turnaround of the game happened. This is move 41. But because the current clock setup in elite tournaments is done in such a way that time is only added when one of the players runs out of the original allotted time for the first time control, you don't actually get any confirmation from the clock on the subject of how many moves are made. And I guess Wesley had not been keeping his score sheet very carefully, or perhaps he didn't trust himself on the subject of how many moves were made. Because despite the fact that he could have just gone up once again to just get a drink of water, calm yourself down and calculate, he blitzed out his next move to make sure that he makes move 40. And the move he made just loses on the spot instead of a different move. And there really only are two moves for black to choose from in this position. One move draws in a very, very simple fashion once you see it, and the other one loses also without really too much in a way of intrigue. Wesley goes rook d3, instead of which, once again, leaving of course the knight on g4 unprised, but going rook d2 would lead to an immediate draw, because the only way to not get mated here would be to take hg. Queen h8 is a tremendously strong threat. The only way really not to get mated for white once again is to play queen g2. Black gives check, takes the queen, gives a check from h3, gives a check from f3, and there will be a perpetual on these squares. It's not even, like, once you realize rook d2 exists, the calculation will take you about 20 seconds. But Wesley, I guess, was, he felt that he is about to lose on time, so he blitzes rook d3. And in this position, the only move white can make not to get mated once again is queen g2. Everything else actually loses. But by this point, I think both of them realized that the time control has been reached, and Fabi took his time. He would have done this quickly as well, because there's really nothing else. But Fabi took his time, played queen g2, and Wesley, at this point, realized that rook d3 played fast was completely unnecessary, and also that his position is lost. There's just no attack here. Black doesn't develop nearly enough activity. The only move to even continue the game is rook g3, which is what Wesley played. And strictly speaking, queen f1 is probably the cleaner solution of the two, but there's really no reason for white to not take on g4. Rook takes, king g2. h4 is the only shot black really has. At least, you know, threatening queen g3 check with some perpetuals, and the white rooks are positioned in such a way that it is actually possible to blunder something here. But once once white realizes that king f3 exists as an option, he will play this move, and yeah, this position is just completely lost. The game continued, queen g3 check, king e2, h3, rook g1, queen h4, and here Fabi played e5, and Wesley resigned because here he won't even be able to pick up the pawn on g4, which he rejected early in the game, because after h2, white has rook g d1, and if you take, white goes bishop e3, discovered checks, and wins even the queen on g4. So with that resignation after e5, Fabiano Caruana scored +2, and because Magnus did not win his game and Hikaru did not win his, with this victory Fabiano won the Norway Chess 2018 outright, which is a tremendous achievement for him, obviously. He started the tournament by losing in round 1 to Magnus, and then won 3 games in the following 7 rounds, because of Ding's withdrawal, only 8 games were played here. So +3 against this field after getting completely outplayed in round 1 is a great show of strength, which is obviously very, very welcome, a very, very welcome sight for him before the World Championship match in November. So congratulations to Fabi on this victory, and this has been a very long video, but I felt that this game really deserved it. I hope you stayed with me till the end, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. This is Peter Svidler signing off with our coverage of the Norway Chess 2018. Bye.